All right, thanks, Tim, and thanks to the team for inviting me to present today. So in the next 10 minutes, hopefully I'll explain really why I took this job a few months ago, because my background is an MD, PhD with an MBA as well, but most of my life spent in the US working at Genentech, a big biotech company, and more recently a smaller biotech where I took 2 small molecule or daily pills from the preclinical animal testing stage through into phase 3. Successfully took that company public with my colleagues. I was the founding chief medical officer then, and sold that company to Sanofi for 3.7 billion. So I've been through the whole cycle of developing drugs and successfully partnering and doing fairly large deals. And when I looked at Actinogen, I was very excited to find kind of a similar story to this company I was working at called Principia, with a somewhat de-risked asset in clinical development and really, if you like, a pipeline within a pill. Multiple different diseases could be treated by the one medication. To the next slide, just a usual disclaimer, we are a public company, forward-looking statements. And on this slide, we really summarize the company's position in a snapshot. It's a very favorable small molecule once-a-day drug with a low dose. It gets into the brain where its target is this enzyme called 11-beta HSG1, which reduces the level, by blocking that enzyme, you reduce the level of toxic cortisol, the stress hormone, inside brain cells, and thereby potentially aid cognition or the ability to think, as well as other symptoms in various diseases. The molecule itself is a very favorable looking pharmaceutical with low drug interaction potential, which is great, and a low dose. And so far, in more than 200 people treated, we've seen very good tolerability and safety. We've got a lot of clinical data, which is a wonderful position to be in. And we're now in the phase 2 stage, or the middle stage of testing in studies here in Australia, and they will broaden out to overseas in the future. It's a significant opportunity commercially and clinically because mild cognitive impairment, the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, is a huge potential market. Very recently, there was some excitement because Biogen and Eisai got an antibody to amyloid approved by the FDA, not necessarily because it even worked, because it showed mixed results, but because it changed biomarkers. And that's something that we'll be exploring in our next clinical study. We're also looking into starting a study this year in Fragile X, which is the commonest cause of intellectual disability in children. And we have a strong cash balance of more than 13 million as of the last quarter, and excellent patents in place for intellectual property. So to the next slide. Our top shareholder is the BVF partners in America. I'm the next biggest shareholder, and I put some of my own money into a placement before I took this job. As I do with Principia, I like to put my own money and investment into a company when I believe in the technology. And Edinburgh Technology, where the original technology came from, is another top shareholder. We've seen significant volatility in the price. It was about 2 cents when I took over and peaked at 19.5 cents in the excitement in the Alzheimer's field. And there's been a significant pullback since then, but still leaving us with a valuation of around 150 to 200 million, which I hope I'll show you is significantly less than true valuation for peer companies in the US, and based on the level of clinical data and risk that we have in this company. We have a very experienced board and a senior leadership team as well. Next slide. So the mechanism, as I mentioned, is to inhibit this enzyme in the brain. And previously, this was a very exciting area of research because cortisol was known to be toxic in animal models, and also there was some human data suggesting it could improve cognition if you reduced it, but no one's ever had a good-looking small molecule that penetrated the brain adequately, and that's what Actinogen has today. Next slide. Our pipeline chart looks like this, with the lead program being Alzheimer's disease. We recently, last month, started the Xanamea study, which is studying 10 milligram, 5 milligram, and placebo dose groups in about 100 healthy older volunteers over the age of 50 here in Australia. That study will be completed quite quickly. The second part of the study will commence next year, and that will be in Alzheimer's patients who have diagnostic positive biomarkers in their blood, and we'll be studying the effect on cognition in these Alzheimer's patients, but also the effects of the drug on biomarkers. We've had a very good and positive meeting. Sorry, get back to that last slide. We've had a very positive meeting with the FDA, and we are now moving to file the IND and commence a Fragile X study in adolescent boys here in Australia by the end of the year. And later in the year, we'll be announcing a third indication to pursue as well. Next slide. The company is unusual and the molecule is unusual in that here we are at the beginning of phase 2 with evidence that our drug improves cognition or the ability to think. And these are the results achieved in the Xanahess previous study of a 20 milligram dose versus placebo, a randomized placebo-controlled study where we saw strongly significant results in improved memory in the left panel, visual attention in the center, and a strong trend to positivity in psychomotor function. These are 3 of the 6 domains of the Cogstate Neuro Test Battery. This is a much more sensitive endpoint than traditional endpoints used by companies like Biogen, and much more amenable to detecting early activity of the drug than other endpoints. To the next slide. So the new study called Xanamere is bridging those data from the Xanahess study I just showed you through into patients with mild cognitive impairment due to biomarker positive Alzheimer's disease, and also demonstrating, therefore, in part B, the effect of our drug potentially on biomarkers, which would show that the drug could be disease modifying as well as enhancing cognition in the short term. There's a huge potential market that I don't really need to go into, and the drug also has significant potential in mild to moderate stages of the disease as well. Previously, the company did have a negative phase 2 study, which was only 12 weeks long and in mild clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's disease. This was a study designed in the middle of the last decade and didn't use these modern sensitive endpoints that I was talking about just now. And it was almost certainly a negative, a false negative readout. To the next slide. A little bit of detail on the study we're conducting. Part A is the dose ranging study of placebo or the sugar pill versus 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams. We're using the Cogstate test that we showed positive data in before and supplementing that with something called the digit symbol substitution test, which was used and is approved by the FDA for an antidepressant called vortioxetine for cognitive enhancement. So this is a regulatory endpoint. And it will confirm the minimally effective dose or doses that we should further study in patients. And then next year, we'll be commencing the patient study of biomarkers, but using these same sensitive endpoints of cognition. And the idea there would be to show efficacy of 1 or more doses of Xanamem in patients themselves. To the next slide. The reason we are very confident about using lower doses of this molecule is that a human PET study was recently completed in Melbourne. And on the left, you see a composite image of about 30 older volunteers, some of them with Alzheimer's disease, where you see the 11-beta HSD1 enzyme glowing in green and gold. On the right, you see the near complete suppression of that enzyme after 7 days of once daily treatment with a 5 milligram capsule, a 10 milligram capsule, or 20 milligrams. And this is what we call a very flat dose response, meaning low doses are relatively as effective as high doses. And this is consistent with what we've seen with other measures of pharmacodynamic effect. So for that reason, we are now exploring low doses, because when you go into large populations like Alzheimer's, you need to prove to the regulators that you're studying the minimally effective dose. And this is very important to access the big clinical and commercial markets that we hope to access with this drug. So the next slide. So our Fragile X program is a proof of concept study that we are starting this year. Fragile X is an unmet medical need in the sense that there are no approved drugs to treat it. There's a couple of companies in the US that have shown some phase 2 data that's promising, but strategically for us, it's a very beneficial strategy that potentially, if the phase 2 study is positive, could get us approved much faster than Alzheimer's disease. So it's our fast to market strategy. The FDA has already awarded us a rare pediatric disease designation. This gives us a priority review for the program, but most importantly, a second priority review voucher, which is tradable. So in that case, should we get approved for Fragile X quickly, we could trade that voucher for in the order of $100 to $125 million US. We've already had positive feedback from the FDA, and there are other disorders that are related, such as autism spectrum disorder, that would significantly increase the global market size from 250 million to at least twice that. To the next slide. So to summarize where we are right now, we are accelerating clinical development, looking to initiate 3 different clinical programs or new studies in those this year. We've got significant potential commercial value. We're always talking to big pharma about potential partnerships. We had a successful bio presentation recently where we actively engaged with many different potential partners. There's a great deal of interest in Alzheimer's, partly because of the Biogen approval of their drug, which is the first in 20 years. Overall, our progress now is considerable. We've started the new clinical study called Xanamere, and we'll start the Fragile X study shortly. So the last point I guess I would make, just sorry, back to that slide. Compared to peer companies in the US, our valuation is still significantly lower than the minimum of about 300 million for companies like us with a small amount of clinical data, whereas we have a lot of clinical data. So there's a lot of value that we can create in the short term with these clinical studies that we are optimizing. To the next slide. And we have a great set of advisors in Alzheimer's, but also not shown in Fragile X. To the next slide. And just to finish off, so our first clinical data will read out in the first half of next year. And then in 2023, we will get data from the second part in patients with Alzheimer's disease, Fragile X, and the third indication. So I think I'll pause there for Q&A. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Stephen. A couple of technical questions, if any. So your phase 2 Alzheimer's and Fragile X trials have been conducted in Australia only. Why is the company choosing to operate under the US FDA investigational new drug conditions for these trials?
Yeah, thanks. The US FDA is arguably the world's best regulatory authority, and by operating under an IND, you essentially get the blessing from them for development in the world's largest pharmaceutical market, commercial, in terms of commercial value. They also give a blessing for your preclinical toxicology and manufacturing. That is a much stronger validation than you would get if you operated just in Australia under a CTN scheme, for example. So in general, we like to operate under a US IND and also, of course, talk to the European authority as we go along.
Now, you obviously put your own money into the business, and we celebrate strong alignment from management. But Alzheimer's has proven to be a difficult indication for companies who have gone after it. What are the kind of top reasons that attracted you to the company?
Yeah, so we are in an unusual situation, and I'm willing to say that this program for Alzheimer's is somewhat de-risked, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not in this case, because we've shown that the drug does improve cognition. And this is not a result that came out of the blue. There was a previous molecule called carbenoxolone that was a non-selective inhibitor of the enzyme, and it also showed improved cognition in healthy older people. So we showed that again, so in essentially confirming that our selective molecule, which is much safer and suitable for Alzheimer's, it worked too, and now we're going to confirm it again in the first part of this next study. So we've got excellent safety data in more than 200 humans, plus we've got efficacy and cognition. So we're a long way down the track to having de-risked the program for this indication.
Now, and you mentioned the FDA, they approved Aduhelm, I believe, back in the first time since 2003, they've actually approved an Alzheimer's drug. What's your view on that, and how can that help your business?
So the Biogen SI approval is for their antibody, which is very different than our once-a-day pill, which is much easier and convenient, more convenient to take. But they've given the whole field a boost because it's now exciting to think that the FDA is willing to consider relatively modest evidence of efficacy compared to safety for this field, and be more aggressive in allowing molecules to go forward into commercial arena. So for us, it's generally a good thing. Our drug can be combined with an antibody therapy or with another small molecule, so we're in a perfect position to investigate monotherapy or efficacy on our own, but also in combination with things like that antibody.